Hello, welcome to the Language and Power Podcast, Series 4, Episode 5, recording on Wednesday, the 13th of December, 2023. I'm Michael Farrelly, and with me, as always, is Tom Bartlett. Hi, Tom. How are you doing?
I'm well, Michael, and thank you for phasing in an old fossil to the programme. This is what we'll pick up on.
Absolutely, because today we are discussing the text of the final agreement reached at COP28, announced as we're recording this morning. The final agreement uses the words fossil fuels, which is important, and we're interested in both the text of the agreement itself and the reaction, some of the reaction to it. So, shall we go straight into the first text then, shall we?
Straight in.
So this
Get the
is
first tackle in.
the first, this is the framework convention on climate change. And already the famous text section, we'll focus straight in, we'll go straight into that, is on page 5 of the document. It's section 28, paragraph D, and it says, transitioning away from fossil fuels in energy systems in a just, orderly and equitable manner, accelerating action in this critical decade so as to achieve net zero by 2050 in keeping with the science. So the crucial phrase there, or a couple of crucial phrases, transitioning away from and fossil fuels in energy systems. So Tom, what's your first reaction to that?
Approaching it straight away from a linguistic angle, but also thinking about what that means. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about language in the press over the last few days. Everyone's been talking about the language and changing the language and mystifying language and all sorts of stuff and getting phrases in. So it shows the power of language that people have been high-ranking people on big salaries have been arguing about these phrases for a long time. So they do find it important. But I'm also looking at, I mean, there's been a big hoo-ha about the fact that fossil fuels has been included in this. I think this is the first time the phrase fossil fuels has been included at all. Is that right, Michael? Yeah.
Yeah, so they have this agreed text every COP, and this is the first time in 28. This is the 28th COP, so for 28 years, and they haven't had fossil fuels, as far as I
Which is
understand.
quite phenomenal.
In this, yeah.
So it's the language around fossil fuels. So obviously it's great news to include the word fossil fuels, and this harks back to the beginning, and LGB talk about working with the gas companies and the oil companies and inclusion in terms of who's involved, but also what's said. So we see that fossil fuels is in there. It's been on the cards and it's been debated for a long time, and the fact that it was more or less explicitly forbidden meant it was on the cards in a different way. So it's been lurking in the background. Connected with that, particularly, is the difference between phasing out, phasing down, phasing away from. So we'll see that we've now got transitioning away from, so we can think about that. But there's also all that language around that. It sort of reminds me in linguistic terms about what we call modality and also phase, to bring in the word of the moment, where modality is the space between yes and no, as in might, could, should, maybe, sometimes, all that stuff. And so there's a lot of that going on here. It's the space between yes and no. Okay, so we've got the word fossil fuels in here, but it's heavily modalized, if you like. There's so many conditions and words and also phases in terms of whether something is starting, stopping, continuing, trying to come about. And again, this whole text is full of that because you say that section D, because it's presented in bullet points, transitioning away from fossil fuels in energy systems. But in fact, if you look, that is the second half of a clause that starts with the opening bit of 28, which talks about the need for deep, rapid and sustained reductions in greenhouse gases. Yeah, it recognises that. We admit that's true. It calls on parties to contribute. So it's asking, we've got a command here, a polite command, to contribute to the following global efforts. So not individually, but to contribute. So do a bit, not a lot necessarily, but to be part of the global efforts in a nationally determined manner. That's really important. So we're calling on people to contribute to efforts to transition away from. So we're already. It's very heavily modalized. This and transition in itself, of course, is moving from one to another. It's not completing it. So we've got a lot of phase. We've got a lot of things starting and continuing. We're not necessarily stopping, and then a lot of modality about that. So it's already heavily linguistically contextualized.
Yeah, it is, isn't it? And even, I mean, I've been thinking about this in contrast to what has been debated over the last couple of weeks about, is it going to be phasing down or phasing out of fossil fuels? And the big talk was then that neither phrase comes into this agreement, is transitioning away. But you're right, it's still a very modalized phrase, that is it. Transitioning away from still implies that the fossil fuels are still there. And for some people, hopefully those fossil fuels will still be in the ground. But for other people, there's plenty of space there to say, oh, well, no, actually, they're still in use. So that's where the modality comes in, isn't it? It leaves that interpretive gap, I guess.
Yeah. And,
Yeah,
and stuff lawyers have become rich on interpreting
mm,
when that modality is and what it means.
yeah,
I think
indeed.
that's really, and then it does say so as to achieve net zero, which is great
Yeah.
in keeping with the science. Well, I think, okay, interesting they felt the need to put that in there, but in case of any skeptics. But it doesn't say we have to get that if we remember the beginning, that debate we talked about where Al-Jaber was on a Zoom call with Mary Robinson,
Mm,
and he said we do not need to get rid of
mm,
carbon fuels in order to achieve net zero. So this paragraph actually leaves that open. We need to achieve net zero, and as part of that process, we're transitioning away from carbon fuels, fossil fuels, but it doesn't actually say that the total stop of carbon fuel emissions is necessary for the net
mm,
zero. So
mm,
it acknowledges we need that goal, and it acknowledges we need to do something about the fossil fuels, but it doesn't say we need to stop fossil fuels completely.
yeah.
So it's landmark to get it in here, but it's still heavily,
Yeah.
you know, contingent on so many things,
Yeah.
which is probably a good thing, but it just sort of makes you wonder exactly where we are.
Yeah. I think, yeah, all of that. I'm just wondering, one thing that you sort of, I think you slightly skipped over. When you said in keeping with the science, it says in keeping with this with the science. It really stands out for me. You kind of, and you mentioned it as you were talking about that. On the one hand, it could be that they feel that they need to mention that the scientific backing, but I'm sure there have been scientists saying here, what say scientists over the past couple of weeks saying the science is that we need to stop fossil fuels. And so I think it's an interesting rhetorical move to keep it in. It makes it sound as though the science says transitioning away from fossil fuels is scientifically sound, as opposed to what I've heard other people claiming over that couple of, which is that actually stopping is the scientifically sound version.
Yeah, I hadn't. Yeah.
You'd have to have a climate scientist to kind of really judge that, but the language suggests there's something slippery in there,
No,
I
you're
think.
right. Right. I was wondering what it was doing dangling there, but you're quite right. It is instead of saying the science says we must do this, it's saying we only need to do that in keeping with the science and not with your hysteria. And we will tell you what.
Yeah.
And as you know, Jabir said that the science
Mm,
says we don't need to do this.
yeah.
So I think that you're right. That's absolutely fascinating.
Interesting one,
Eh,
isn't it?
What
Mm,
is interesting linguistically as well in terms of grammar nerds,
yeah.
that in keeping with the science without a comma before it, I so quite right, Michael, you're saying it's connected with transitioning away from fossil fuels and that the whole thing in keeping with the science. I was just reading at the end of the sentence that we need to
Ah.
reach net zero in accord. It's very difficult
Mm,
to know how
mm,
much comes with it, what we say in linguistics comes within the scope of that adverbial phrase.
yeah.
What what amount of that text is in keeping with the science? Well, how much of that do we need to bear in mind?
Mm,
Again, it's
true.
yeah,
True.
it,
True.
it's difficult to know.
Another reading of this could be that the in keeping with the science only applies to the idea of achieving net zero by 2050, right?
Yeah,
That's another. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
which is how I read it, and I thought, well, that doesn't
Yeah.
make
Yeah.
so much sense because everyone accepts that. But I
Yeah.
get you; it's actually at the
Yeah.
end of the clause.
Yeah.
So framing the whole clause and saying, you know, only as far as science says we need to transition away. We need to transition away, just like science says. In other words, like you picked up and I hadn't noticed,
Yeah. Yeah.
it's sort of saying that science doesn't need to say.
Yeah.
It's like saying science doesn't say that we need to stop it. It's actually giving support for the phasing, for the transitioning away, rather than
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
complete stop. And that's
Yeah.
really interesting, clever
Yeah.
piece of
Yeah.
wordsmithery.
Yeah. Well, and this is important because, as you said earlier, people have been wrangling for 2 weeks at least over what phrasing, what wording is going to go in this. And it's not it's not the case that any words will do as long as they're in the right ballpark, because otherwise they would have just gone with something like phase out or phase down or whatever, the fact that they've had to negotiate this particular wording means that it's important to somebody, a lot of them. The question is, well, what is the reason? Why do they want it to say this and not something more very, very unequivocal, I should say.
Yeah.
Very, very unequivocal stopping so that's the question, isn't it? So, yeah, I think that's important. I often, sometimes we're talking about the semantics, and we talk about this with with students, and my kind of example of this is I always get very annoyed in the UK when politician is being questioned, and a defense that they often put up is, well, that's just semantics. You're talking about semantics here, as though semantics is not important.
Yeah.
Well, and then I say to them, well, semantics is about what you're talking about, what it means, and whether it's true or not. And so it's very, very pertinent often.
I think it's normally said as well, it shows by the cleverer of the politicians a deep understanding of how important the semantics is, because they're sort of saying of other people it's just semantics to offer this alternative, because they know themselves that actually it makes a big difference. They need to dismiss that other wording because it doesn't do what they know their wording does. And so I think, it's just semantics. Let's stick with mine, because they know actually semantics can be important. It's a double, not a double bluff, but a bit of chicanery.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, so I mean, a thing to think about, and maybe we'll come back to it in a future episode, is what's the different sense of transitioning away versus phasing out versus phasing down, and all those
Well,
things.
transitioning away is also, to me, is very interesting. They put transitioning, and I'm not sure why that was instead of phasing. Phasing away from means doing things gradually. Okay, maybe fast gradual or slow gradual. Transitioning away from, there's part of the sentence missing. So you transition away from something to something.
Yeah.
And that is,
yeah.
do we green energy? What? The two transition is a process and entails from to. And it's not to zero carbons that we could just use phasing away. So you're left wondering, someone probably wanted transitioning put in to leave that open to say what to, but who knows?
Yeah, definitely not in that section D, but in the following one, which is we are being very grammar nerds here. I'm going to be punctuation nerd as well, because there's a semicolon there separating it, so it is a new part. They do talk about accelerating zero and low emission technologies in that section, but we're now not talking about the same thing. There's it's an elaboration, is it, or an additional part, not.
And what would be really interesting then is these H is what's 8, isn't it? 8 points. What's the sequencing about? The order of urgency, the one we agreed on most? Is it a logical order, cause and effect, or is it a temporal order? There's obviously a connection, as you say, there implied between transitioning away from and accelerating alternatives. But we have to read that connection between those two sections in. But it would be really interesting to look and see what type of connection there is between these things that are presented consecutively as points. They're not random order.
No.
But we have to work out what the connection is between them.
Yeah, we do.
And while we've got our nerd hats on, the one that I liked early was H, which says, it has no punctuation up until, well, I'll read it out with punctuation, like my French dictation teacher used to do. Phasing out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies that do not address energy poverty or just transitions, comma, as soon as possible. So, okay, so as soon as possible. But one thing is, we've got this nominal group, inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. Now, we don't know if this is fossil fuel subsidies that are inefficient or subsidies for inefficient fossil fuel, because there's no hyphen being used. The reason that we put the hyphen in is to avoid that ambiguity. So we're not quite sure. Are we saying there's inefficient fossil fuel and therefore none of that should be subsidized? Or we should say that we can carry on subsidizing things as long as that subsidy is efficient? But then it says that do not address energy poverty, which we assume is the subsidies. But does this mean, the way it's written, it means that any subsidies, whether they be inefficient or not efficient, that address energy poverty, can be kept. But if it doesn't address energy poverty, then it's not efficient. So I sort of get a feeling that this was supposed to be a defining clause that says all of these, none of these
Mm,
address energy poverty, therefore we get rid of them. But it's not. It's saying some of them do, some of them don't. But
yeah.
so you only need to get rid of those that don't. And then there's is it the inefficient
Mm,
subsidy or the so there's
mm,
some is this modality again, there's so much between
yeah.
the absolute truth on either side
Yeah.
that we're not
Yeah.
quite sure what's going on
Yeah. Yeah.
and what nations are not required to do even, but us being to choose to opt in towards contributing to.
Yeah. 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 It all rests on that word "that" in there, doesn't it? Is the subordinate, is it subordinate clause, subordinate phrase there, clause or clause on that do not address. Now, yeah, as you say, is that defining or is it relative on that? Is it are we saying that, let's have a look at it. Phasing out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies that do not address energy poverty or just transitions. So the other, as you said, the other ones that do address energy poverty and just transitions are fine. Or is
But
it?
wouldn't they by definition be efficient then? And so we've got a redundancy of wording
So we
here.
got, yeah, exactly, yes. So you've got. I mean, I think you potentially this was put together in a rush at the end, but at the same time, it's very, very heavily negotiated and thought about by a lot of people. But it's left a lot of room for the kinds of things that legal scholars, legal minds, lawyers can get their hands on and
And,
argue
and
what is
some of
meant
it's
by this.
deliberately vague, and that's been very cleverly worded to be ambiguous or vague, and some of it's poor wording. But again, we are interested in the language. We're allowed to be nerdy today. This
Yeah,
is
yeah,
the stuff that decisions are made
yes,
on and that
yeah,
legal
yeah, yeah.
cases are made on, and it really does make a difference to know what counts as what's legal or not going forwards. And it makes me think of any document that's produced in the European Union that is then translated into all the languages it has to be translated into. If there's a disagreement about the semantics, it's the original document in the language it was written in is the point of reference. So if any of these ambiguities have been cleared up or introduced in translation, they're ignored. You go back and you argue over precisely this. There's no comma there, or there's the word that instead of the word which. Therefore, I'm allowed to keep producing this coal. A comma can have big
Mm,
consequences.
yeah, yeah. Who'd have thought it? Yeah, absolutely. Um, yes. So the questions, you've got these specific detailed questions. You've got the bigger question as to why would people put these things in? Why do people want to have these vagaries in? Why do people want to have transitioning away from instead of phasing out or phasing down? Why are you still allowed to have um, energy poverty or just transition fossil fuels and so on? So these are the questions that you've got to ask. What motivates people to want to have this language and not another language? And I think that's where you start to kind of understand what's going on. I, I don't know. I've yeah. We'll see what the commentary comes out from other people on this and see
That would be
see
really
see
interesting,
their
won't it? And
interpretation of
if
this.
anyone of our listeners wants to say something about it.
Yeah,
But
absolutely.
what I do like about it in political terms, and I think what makes it
Hmm.
tricky is consensus. And I know you've got something to say about a big banner headline about consensus. These are all countries with very different needs and capabilities and approaches to it. So, how important is the very fact of reaching consensus rather than detail and that level of compromise? And we'll talk about
Interesting.
this in a later episode again when we talk about positive discourse analysis. Getting people to agree, when is that good consensus and when is it maybe bad consensus because you end up not saying anything of any worth. But what I found really the end of the opening section of point 28, taking into account the Paris Agreement, of
Hmm.
course, that's the start of it all, and each country's different national circumstances, pathways, and approaches. Now, from
Hmm.
as a discourse analyst, I always say context is all. Different things mean different things in different contexts, and so the wording has got to allow for justifiable variation in people's approaches while cutting out as much of the bad stuff as possible. And just hearing one of the things last night, I was hearing about the smaller nations or the less economic developed nations. Again, this compromise, a lot of them want to keep burning fossil fuels to so that they can transition. They'll have the money necessary to transition to green energy. And they're saying, without making that money from our existing fossil fuels, we haven't got the capability to do this transition.
Mm.
And therefore, we're going to end up worse, or you guys give us trillions of dollars. So you can see that, well, is burning fossil fuels in order to fund the green transition. Wow, what sort of is that a good compromise or a bad compromise? But that's why a lot of this language isn't. It's not just the fuel companies and the oil producing company, big multi-trillion nations that want this. It is nations with a good intention to transition to green economies, but saying, but we need money first.
Yeah,
And it's that tricky
yeah,
situation. So a lot of the language is about trying to cater
yeah,
to all these
yeah.
different needs in a just way.
Absolutely. I think it would be really interesting also to hear what economists think about this, because surely as production slows down of fossil fuels, it becomes more expensive as well. So I would assume. So
Yeah.
it would be very interesting to see what economists make of that and how it fits in with this wording as well. Speaking of the reaction, so shall we move on to the reaction?
Yeah, absolutely.
So how is this being received? So again, we're recording on the day as we kind of we were awaking here in the British Isles. We kind of woke up to this agreement having been made. The first thing on the website of the COP28, it's been quite heavily marketed as a success. Of course, they would market it as a success. The front page of the website, as I looked at it this morning, had a large group photograph of world leaders, including I can see King Charles at the front of that from the UK, and they're standing in front of a physical wording, which says, "We united, we acted, we delivered," and then there's a text box superimposed on the front of that photograph, which says the UAE consensus. So it's being branded here as you were mentioning, a consensus, the UAE consensus, and it's all about uniting and acting and delivering. So that's how they're portraying it. But we've had some reactions from well-known people who've been involved in these negotiations. So can talk of a few of those for a while. First one, Mary Robinson. Mary Robinson, we've mentioned a couple of times during this series, former president of the Republic of Ireland, and is one of, I think, perhaps the chair of a group called the Elders, which is associated with the UN climate change agenda of, I guess, elder statesmen of climate politics. And her statement about this agreement goes as follows. I don't know how much I should read about this, but she says this: the COP28 agreement, while signalling the need to bring about the end of the fossil fuel era, falls short by failing to commit to a full fossil fuel phase out. If 1.5 degrees is our North Star and science our compass, we must swiftly phase out all fossil fuels to chart a course towards a livable future. To fail to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius has catastrophic implications for the most vulnerable communities and countries. And then there's more to that statement, but do you want to comment on that, Tom?
Yeah, and it's interesting, isn't it? Mary Robinson here explicitly uses the term phase out. That very contentious term. That's no accident that she's used that. Talking of modality, we must. There's no room for negotiation there. It's absolutely what we call strong deontological modality. And this group, that includes all of us. So while she agrees that there's been some stuff, she's actually contradicting the main finding, which was to recognise the need to contribute to transitioning away from. It says we must swiftly phase out. They're exactly the same sort of terms of grammar. They're the same. There's just a lot more in one of them.
Yeah. And I think strategically, it's important that people agree, that something's happened, and fossil fuels being in there is a large change, but it's also important to stake out, a claim for the future negotiations, because this process will go on next year and the following year and the following year. And so it's good to keep pushing the for something better, I suppose. In this way.
Indefatigability, I think, was the phrase you said, the words you came
Indefatigable.
up with earlier.
Be
We've got to keep
indefatigable.
going.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we battle
Yeah.
on, we battle on.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think Mary Robinson's sort of doing that as well. It's the question we've asked ourselves many times in this series. What is the point of what all the speeches, the glossy speeches at COP, and do they lead the agenda or follow the agenda? And I think there's a feeling that maybe, we've seen fossil fuels introduced hugely compromised, but it's on the table. I think Mary Robinson is saying this, she comes up with a lovely sentence that nations have managed to salvage enough common ground in Dubai to keep the climate action process moving forward is notable. So she recognizing that common ground, this side of consensus, which has been bigged up as a huge result, as it is by the presidents of each COP. This was the COP where we agreed this. So she's acknowledging that progress and loss and damage and tripling renewable energy demonstrate the vital role of multilateralism in addressing the climate crisis. Again, this has been put on the table. The loss and damage wasn't to be mentioned in Glasgow. There was this retribution. Remember me and Motley talking about a lot.
Yeah.
Now is coming back onto the table. And then at COP28, transparency, equity, and climate justice have been undermined. So it's a recognition that this is an improvement, but then saying it's not going far enough. And it's, as you were saying, it's incremental. It's a need for indefatigability. I was hearing again another journalist last night on the radio saying that he starts every COP full of enthusiasm and ends up wringing his hands in despair. But when he looks back over 3 or 4 COPs, he sees there has been this movement, this change. And so what seems like blah, 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 Pace, Greta, is actually maybe a sign of some move. The problem is that whether the speed of these negotiations is glacial, while the glaciers are melting around us.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. No, I think that's right. Another reaction, slightly different. John Kerry, the US climate envoy, he said, "It is a document that reflects 2 years of work by all parties from every part of the globe. While nobody here will see their views completely reflected, the fact is that this document sends a very strong signal to the world. We have to adhere to keeping 1.5 in reach. In particular, it states that our next NDCs will be aligned with 1.5. It reflects what the science says. We have to urgently peak GHG emissions and have them fall." So NDCs, nationally determined contributions, and greenhouse gases, the GHG. So yeah, saying something similar is good as far as it goes. He's saying it slightly differently, isn't he? He's saying, while nobody here will see their views completely reflected. That's the definition of compromise, isn't it?
It is.
On here.
But he said it without much detail.
Yeah.
He said a lot of Mary Robinson says, but she throws in a lot of the detail, what's there, what's not. And he's just saying, well, not everyone can be happy. Not everyone can be totally happy.
Yeah. And we were talking earlier before we started recording about what kinds of things can you compromise on. Is climate change a thing that you can reasonably compromise on? It needs to be sorted out. So we've had 28 years of these kinds of negotiations, and it's the first time that fossil fuels has been mentioned. And whenever I'm looking at the discourse on this, one of my very often a starting point is, how come it's taken so long? We've known about this stuff for a very, very long time. I remember being at school and thinking about knowing about greenhouse gases and various things. So it's a very, very long time. So yeah, there's that. Anything else to say about John Kerry's?
Yeah, I like it in a way because I find it interesting that he's doing the same job as Mary Robinson, but it's pretty vacuous. He's saying we can't all agree on stuff. We've done a good job. We've got to keep working. Whereas Mary Robinson actually a harder language to follow, but she fills in those gaps where we've gone forward, what we still have to do, and not just saying we've done some and we've done the other. They're actually giving some concrete examples. So I think I quite like, while keeping it relatively soundbite, she's managed to get a lot more information in here. But again, the compromise, I love this idea at the end. We have to urgently peak greenhouse gas emissions. So we're actually not even talking about reducing them yet.
Yeah.
We have to peak them as soon as possible and then start reducing them. And this always comes, okay, yeah, we're not, the temperature's not rising as quickly as it was previously. Yeah, but still going up. It's not coming down yet, but it's just not getting quite so drastic. Well, it's
Yeah.
still an increase.
Yeah.
So a little bit of that. And then the last one that you sent was from Anne Rasmussen, the negotiator, making the incredible statement that actually this was rubber stamped and hurried through by Sultan Al Jaber, while some of the smaller nations were still negotiating their response to the document, and they were expecting more negotiation, and it was passed through. And from what we can read, it seems to be legally binding, even though those countries weren't there. So this is trouble ahead, I'm sure, because there are problems. But the fact again, this need to finish on a headline consensus for the COP itself as an event to be successful, rather than global warming to be tackled. COP itself has to be each iteration has to be seen as a success for the home nation.
Yeah. And this is about the process. And, discourse analysis is not just about looking at the details of the words, what's being represented, but also about the process by which you communicate with each other and come to kind of whatever. So it's that side of the discursive practice. So it looks like something significant happened here. And one of the things that we've noticed just over the course of today is that the UK press are reporting this, as far as we can see, and we're not kind of totally monitoring it, but then it's not particularly emphasized. So it looks like something went wrong with the process. I'll just read out. This was from the live feed from The Guardian, so it's not a complete report, but this was how they were writing it on one of their sort of news boards. There was confusion in the plenary hall when Sultan Al Jaber passed the text without hearing any statements from countries or parties. Writes Patrick Greenfield. We had all been expecting a lengthy day of debates about how the text might be changed for one final version, but this is not happening. The gavel is down and the agreement has passed. And then there's a quote from Anne Rasmussen. This process has failed us, she said. And she's acting as the chair of the Alliance of Small Island States. So something's happened where the gavel has gone down, as a judge's kind of gavel. The text seems to have been officially endorsed by the COP president, whilst, as you said, some nations had not apparently agreed to. But what the exact mechanism for how that can happen is something that we don't have access to. Yeah, but as you say, will they be quiet and say, well, this is okay, or will there be consequences further down the line? And it really does speak to what you're saying about the need for a final kind of curtain.
So good consensus or bad consensus, it's very debatable. And just last small point on that, there was a quote yesterday or the day before, I think, from our old friend Mia Motley saying, why would we vote for our own destruction?
Yeah.
Or why would, I think something like that. They were saying they would not sign up to this because moving away from phase out meant destruction for small island states because of the rising waters particularly. And it's notable that the complaint about not being present at the meeting was those very small island states who are faced by this emergency. It's almost like advantage was taken of the fact they weren't in the room.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, we'll keep an eye on that as well. From a discourse analytical perspective, just rounding up this stage, and we will be back later. We're going to have a break over what's Christmas here for us, and we will come back with a couple more episodes on this COP, with having had time to reflect on this and get some people in to help us with that. But at this point, Tom, we've been looking at text and discourse. What do we take away from what we've looked at so far from a discourse and analytical point of view?
I think it's that, for me, it's been reflecting on the purpose of this event and thinking about it, and the fact that it might be largely blah, blah, blah isn't necessarily the end of the world. There could be reasons for that. We could be having to look at other speeds of textual change and stuff like that. So I find it interesting. But also I keep thinking about, if we're doing discourse analysis, how do we go beyond the easy pickings to try and reach that level of complexity in our analytical work? And it making me question what we do in our own sound bites, because we're as prone
Yeah.
to sound
Yeah,
bites,
of course.
7,000 word sound bites, but they're still
Of
sound
course.
bites.
Of
Yeah.
course, yeah. Yeah. We need to, what we need to do is look at what progress has been made over the course of COPs and look at the language which has led to that progress or the speed of the progress. Because the thing that's now coming to my mind is this question of compromise. And as a discursive strategy, if you know that you're going to end up with compromise, the more extreme your position and unmoving you are, the more you can move things away from
You move the centre towards where you want to be.
towards you are, and that happens in all sorts of policy areas. So I'm
Yeah.
interested to see, I'm struck by the fact that 28 years and fossil fuels has only just appeared in the text of this.
It's a phenomenal fact,
isn't it? Yeah. So yeah, there's all sorts to think about there, but at the same time, not to be defeatist about this, and to use that word again, be indefatigable and keep going. Can't give up, can you? Okay, shall we wrap that one up then?
Yep, here's to indefatigability and see you in the new year.
Yeah, just to say, there are links to all the text we've spoken about in the episode description. We have a website where you can sign up for email alerts, YouTube channel, and Patreon where you can join the discussion. Yeah, thank you very much.
Cheers.
Bye.